Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Greenberg. I'm the travel editor for CBS News and a WTTC ambassador. Welcome to our insight session, a strategic insight session appropriately titled Connected and Recharged. Please let me introduce our panelists for today. From Washington, D.C., Diane Sabatino. She's the Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner, Office of Field Operations, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Welcome, Diane. Michelle McKinney Frymire, who is the Chief Executive Officer at CWT, based in Minneapolis. Diane's in Washington. Miguel Flecha, who's joining us from Madrid, who's the Managing Director of Accenture. And Jenny Mundy, who's in Singapore today, the Senior Vice President and Global Head of Merchant Sales and Acquiring for a little credit card company known as Visa. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. You know, when we talk about connected and recharged, we were talking about that essentially before the pandemic, of course. The technology was still on a very forward ramp at that point. Everybody wanted a seamless travel experience. Nobody wanted to stand in line. Nobody wanted to wait. Everybody's time was essential to them and crucial to them. And then the world came to a halt. It came to a halt when we sat around and ended up watching bad reruns of bad television shows and doing calls on Zoom, like we're doing now. But the technology didn't stop there. It gave people time to rethink, to reset, to reevaluate, to figure out what was working, what wasn't, and to give it enough time, really, to take a deep breath and figure out where we go from here. Some things didn't change. Some things didn't change on the governmental level. Some things didn't change on the payment processing level. Some things didn't change fast enough in travel management, although travel advisors came out of nowhere to make a comeback that nobody ever anticipated. Because of another word that I'm going to use in our conversation today, and that is the word conversation. People started talking to each other. And then, of course, there's just traveler behavior in general, and how do you not only anticipate it, but how do you project demand and then accommodate that? Let me start with one thing that didn't change. And it just happened to me a couple of weeks ago, but it happened to me a couple of months ago, and it happened to me a couple of years ago. It really hasn't changed. And it's a governmental issue. It happens in almost every foreign country I go to, with a couple of exceptions, where ministers, speaking of communication, don't seem to talk to each other. So the Minister of Tourism is not talking to the Minister of Transportation or the Minister of their version of Customs and Border Protection. So coming into Lisbon at 6 o'clock in the morning, there are no surprises. Every flight is coming in at the same time from overseas. And there are 16 passport inspections stations, only 2 of which are manned. When you leave the country, there are 16 inspection stations, only 2 of which are manned. And so all the technology in the world doesn't help your manpower. We're still dealing with staffing shortages on a worldwide level in every single aspect of the travel and tourism industry. The WTTC has done a great job in reporting on those numbers, which are pretty staggering. And yet, you have situations where there was a program in place in the United States called Global Entry, in which once you registered and did your interview, it took, who wanted to stand in line? It gets back to the whole concept of who wants to stand in line after an 11-hour flight for another 2 hours to go through, passport and immigration. Well, just the other day, I came back from Lisbon. By the way, I had to wait for an hour and 45 minutes to get through passport and immigration there. But when I got to the US, in this case JFK, I'm a member of Global Entry, it took me 17 seconds to go through passport control. No line, it was all biometrics. They read my eyes in the machine, issued me a receipt, and I was gone. That is leading the way. And so I'll start with Diane. Because there are other programs that allow you to be reconnected and recharged. One of which is called pre-clearance. Most people don't realize it's been around since 1952 in countries like Canada, the Bahamas, Bermuda, and even Abu Dhabi, where you clear U.S. Customs passport immigration control in that country, so that when you land back in your home country, in this case the United States, you're already home. And it doesn't in any way, shape, or form compromise security or safety. It's technology that really takes the case. So I'll start with you, Diane, in terms of being connected and recharged. During the pandemic, what happened to pre-clearance? And how much have you expanded global entry so that it's even more available?
Well, thank you so much for the kudos on global entry. Really proud of the flagship Trusted Traveler program. And, we were well underway in incorporating and implementing biometric facial comparison technology across the, arrival environment and working with our stakeholders in the airports to implement biometric exit. But our efforts really, we were poised. And while we saw some hesitancy from some of the industry to incorporate the biometric facial comparison technology, again, anytime new technology is rolled out, there are always legitimate questions about privacy, concerns about the implementation and the impact. You can't find a solution that creates a problem, somewhere else in, the chain of travel or in the travel continuum. But because of where we were and the meaningfulness of touchless, given the benefits to the limiting the transmission of pathogens, we were really poised to accelerate our biometric facial comparison into we're at 217 airports now upon arrival in the US, but our biometric facial comparison technology incorporated into our global entry framework as well. And I know you may have seen a kiosk at JFK. The next steps for us, we're actually moving to totems. We've piloted those in e-gates to make it an even more seamless experience, but great to hear that it was such a good experience upon arrival in the US. And again, working to continue to expand that biometric facial comparison in global entry, continue to expand the biometric facial comparison in the air passenger environment overall, but also leveraging mobile applications, our mobile passport control application, again, to reach all of the travelers that are arriving to the US and working with our industry partners to get those messages out there.
We talked about the two words that we've all come to love during the pandemic, social distancing. There was no social distancing in the Lisbon airport. Nobody was standing 6 feet apart. We were 6 inches apart, waiting for an hour and 45 minutes, sort of defeated the whole purpose. That brings me up to pre-clearance, and that is, it's such a great program, and you have it in so many of the airports right now, but they've been there for a while. The latest one, I think, was Abu Dhabi. It's been in Ireland as long as I can remember, where you clear customs and immigration before you actually get on the plane to come home. But what about the big major choke point airports? Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, in those days, Hong Kong, when Hong Kong reopens. What are you doing working with other governments to figure out a way to get somebody to pay for this? Because the technology, of course, is already there.
Absolutely. I think the next location that we are working with is going to be Brussels. We've had a lot of success in the negotiations in that particular location, but we're constantly in discussion with our foreign partners about the opportunities. And I think pre-clearance is a perfect example of that. Again, another location where we're also able to deploy the global entry biometric facial comparison, the simplified arrival biometric facial comparison technology. But we are also partnering with TSA because in addition to the potential for pre-clearance in some of the other locations, they are endeavoring to look at one stop and a seamless process to ensure that the security and the recheck process in the United States is seamless. So a couple of different efforts underway that all will complement each other, potentially as alternatives to each other. Working with the UK is certainly an ideal location for us, as many other locations are.
What's interesting is the new technology that you're using takes away, if you actually look at the actual step-by-step process of how you handle paper documents, it's changing, right? So the number of times you're actually going to your pocket to pull out a passport or to have someone stamp it or to put it into a machine, that's deteriorating in a way, in a good way, where the touch points are going away. And that brings me up to Jenny, because during the pandemic, I learned to hate cash. I actually learned to hate paper money or coins. More and more people changed their behaviors to not want to use cash at all for the health issues that they were worried about who touched the money before they did. And this, of course, is coinciding with the advances that you are doing in your payment processing systems about cards that were now developed with the chips where you can tap, where you weren't necessarily getting a paper receipt that you had to sign, another touch point where you had to hold another object in your hand, a pen, touch paper, interact with a merchant physically. Where are you on that now?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And yeah, I mean, the rise of contactless payments, and you're right. We've seen a big step change in people's desire, and it's not just touching cash initially, but it was touching the screen as well to enter your PIN, or as you point out in the US, a pen, or whatever was needed. So we definitely saw consumers switch more and more to wanting to pay by contactless methods, and also stores themselves. You know, my local supermarket, you know, the guy there, he doesn't want to touch anything if he doesn't have to either. So it really saw that step change. One of the things we did, I think, as an entire financial services industry that I do feel proud about on all of our behalves, and that's in many, many countries at that time, we very, very quickly raised the contactless limits. So if I take the UK, for example, we went all the way up to £100, and it stayed there. And many countries did similar and have kept those high limits. And we found that the fraud levels, which I think a lot of people were worried about, that fraud would increase comparatively, has not increased disproportionately at all. So we've now really seen a tech change that's sustained the way we wanted to live, taken a big step forward very quickly. That was implemented in a matter of weeks. Normally those things take months and months to do. So I think that's one big change that's happened. And of course, the other big change as well in both consumer behavior and that we've seen on shops and retailers more broadly is this move to online. So online has taken a massive step forward. So again, the entrepreneurial small local businesses in particular had to go online, had to do click and collect, and they needed to do those things to survive. And now they've got that capability. A lot of them are thinking about how they can help that, how they can use that to then help themselves really thrive and use that as a growth mechanism. So I think we've seen changes on all fronts.
You know, beware the law of unintended consequences. You talk about online. During the pandemic, I didn't realize how much cardboard I was collecting from Amazon. Every box in the world was coming to my house. In fact, I wasn't even aware I was ordering half of this stuff. It was something that you just did because it was so easy to do. But let me go back to the contactless payment that you just talked about in the travel sector. Just like we talked about with Diane about clearing borders, have you done time and motion studies to figure out how much time now is not being spent on each transaction?
Well, I think certainly in the early days, actually, of rolling out contactless, a lot of time was spent, particularly at supermarkets, working out how many seconds you could save in a single supermarket queue, because of course time is money, and the faster the throughput, one as a consumer, those seconds matter bizarrely or importantly, and of course they matter for the throughput. So, and it is seconds, and it's the same with transport as well. So, for example, when I live in London, it's the same in Singapore now as well. But if you want to go on a tram or a bus or a train, when the tube in London, you could just tap your card and move contactless. That took seconds out of the experience. And those things are important. You're right, Peter. We just want to move through without touching anything and at pace. Those things are very satisfying and they feel very natural.
And not to be proprietary, but are you finding people, once they know it's contactless and it's seamless and it takes less time, that they're actually spending more money?
What we see is that they are more inclined to change their behavior more broadly. So if you get confident, and there are certain things like a tipping point. So if you can catch a bus, something that you do every day, and particularly as a tourist, I think, if you can get on a bus and you can use a card you've got, and you don't have to go and find a machine to buy a different card, and you're not quite sure of the currency and what to do. If you can just get on a bus and tap, you are much more likely then to pay that way over and over again. So we see transport in particular as a real genesis to hit that tipping point for moving behavior. Of course, the pandemic, tragic that it was at the beginning, was a big another driving force for behavior change. And as you quite rightly said, that's driven a lot in the early days by fear.
This is a question for both you, Jenny, and for you, Michelle, in terms of new payment systems that are evolving, which really go back to old days. And it's the fly now, pay later programs that are coming out now, which allow people in a much faster way, paying simple interest, not compound interest, to be able to finance their travel. And you've seen companies like Uplift and others coming in, partnering with major airlines and travel providers to allow people to much more easily, as long as they can afford it, to travel and take away the fear factor of, can I afford it? Are you seeing any kind of growth in that area, Jenny?
Oh, I'll go, and then Michelle, you jump in. Yeah, I mean, look, buy now, pay later is clearly not just in the travel sector, but more broadly, and starting initially in fashion, retail, online. And, Peter, I think the point you made is it can make things easier if you can afford it. And I think that's a really key point, is that we still have to be good at managing our money. And we still need to be sort of prudent around that. And the buy now, pay laters can definitely play a part in that. But I think as well, we need to sort of work with them. And we work at Visa, we work with many of them in making sure that you're still looking after your customers, making sure that they can afford that. And I know governments around the world are keen to make sure that happens as well.
Speaking of looking after your customers, Michelle, I'm going to go right to you on that. At CWT, you had a rough go of it during the pandemic. You saw your revenue go from 100% down to 20. It was a big hit to you. You had to go through a package bankruptcy to basically save and come back out. In that bankruptcy that you went through, what changed in terms of the connectivity that you have with your clients? What changed in terms of the conversation you were having with your clients on both ends, right? The consumer end and the business end.
Yeah, a couple things, Peter. One, I was going to comment on something Jenny said about buy now, pay later. It's very much a leisure travel dynamic. We don't see that too much in business travel because it's always been a very card-centric activity, business travel. Or you've got sort of payment methods with ghost cards, virtual payments. So it's an interesting phenomenon that I think has been really great for the consumer, but not so much ingrained in business travel. For us, during 21, we did affect a very significant recapitalization of our business. And our conversations with our clients, they remained very active and ongoing. Early in the year, clients were thinking about travel, working with them on safety and health issues. In the middle of the year, when we were in the midst of the restructuring, we talked with them about what did it mean for them, how their service wouldn't be affected, how we could continue to serve them, what does a one-day round trip through the courts to implement a restructuring mean? There was a lot of information sharing, but the result of that was continued connectivity with clients so that when we were complete and we could share with them that we had done exactly what we had described and that we had shed a significant amount of debt, brought a lot of cash into the company, really recapitalized the balance sheet. I think it left them with confidence that, we were going to give them good information and we were going to bring them on a journey with us the same way that we've been bringing those clients on the journey with us around new digital tools, new ways to travel, and new ways to think about health and safety of their travelers when they're on trip. The one thing we have seen most pointedly is that the traveler wants an end-to-end pre, on, and post-trip experience, and they want it digital, and they want it to be online, and the vast majority of the time, they want it on their phone. And when we deliver that, we see that clients and thus their travelers feel a lot better about getting back to travel. So that's been a real focus for us and why that's a big part of our investment portfolio.
And you mentioned the word conversation. For those people who thought travel agents were dead, think again. You came back bigger than ever during the pandemic because of that one word, conversation. You were advocates. And this brings up a question I'd love to ask the entire panel, except Diane, because you're off the hook on this one, Diane. But for the other three folks, here's the question. The number one complaint during the pandemic for travelers was refunds. The lack of connectivity, the lack of ability to get money back when their trips were canceled during COVID, and the entire payment processing system came into play, and travel agents were working overtime to advocate for their clients, in many ways not making money at all, losing money because they would lose their commissions once they got the refunds back to their clients. I guess the question becomes for all of you, what's changed in terms of payment processing? What's changed in terms of accounting that will not allow the situation to recur? I'll give you an example. It's a 6-letter word called escrow, right? I can't buy a house and have the deal closed unless the money's in the account, there's a third party overseeing it, and then the money's released when somebody actually moves into the house. What happened during the pandemic? And this is a big visa issue at any credit card issuing company. You know, I put my payment down on a credit card 6 months in advance for a cruise. The cruise gets canceled. It then gets rebooked. I'm offered a 25% basically incentive to get a discount if I rebook it and not get a refund. And then sooner or later, what happens? The cruise line either fails, like we had with Crystal Cruises, or I can't go. I literally, in my own personal schedule, I've exceeded my ability in terms of my ability to go anywhere. And then I can't get my money back. We saw the rise, and Jenny, you know this better than anybody, of holdbacks in terms of the payment process. And are we getting to a point now, since we have the technology to do it, to come up with a much more equal and efficient form of escrow so that the industry is protected, so that the consumer is protected with their investment? Since we have the connectivity, how do we do that?
Well, Peter, maybe I'll start from the business travel aspect, because this has been a big initiative for us, right? Creating a database for all of our clients, for all those unused tickets. What are they going to do with them? How do they track them? It is like currency for our clients, just like, for Visa and for Accenture, it's their currency. And one of the biggest things that we dealt with was making sure that currency stayed valid, that it could get used for a form of payment, and that it could get used even though changes happen in their employee workforce, right? We've all seen that people are moving jobs at a greater rate, but Visa and other clients still need to be able to use that currency of that unused ticket. Being able to bring that to clients and say, hey, let me tell you, I've got a report. I can tell you how many unused tickets you have. When are they going to expire? What is that worth? How do we make sure that when travelers book with us, they're using those unused tickets? That was a really big initiative for us from a business travel perspective. And it took on a whole different aspect again than maybe consumer travel, where they had to really work on their own behalf to use those unused tickets, just like I have. I have a whole list of 8 unused tickets on my favorite Texas-based carrier, and I'm slowly working through them. But I have to be really proactive to use those. At CWT, it was our job to make sure we were proactive on the part of our clients. So from a business travel perspective, that's how we engaged on that issue.
Yeah.
And Peter, I think so. I think the refunds and all these issues is a good representation of the big opportunity that the industry has on digitalizing customer service. So you said the technology is there, but probably the sector is not using it properly, because this is a matter of making sure you use automation, you use data, you use artificial intelligence to actually do this automatically, right? What we experienced during the pandemic with all the refunds that you had to call a call center, the call center was collapsed. So apart from all the payment and all the stuff that I think Michelle explained very well, it's about really bringing technology into the end-to-end customer service and proactively and predictively anticipate to a problem that a traveler will have and solve it.
Exactly. And you talk about the conversation in terms of customer call center. I have to laugh. This happens to me every time I call. I'm a big fan of the conversation. And every time I call an airline, they tell me how long it's going to be before they'll be able to talk to me. Before the recorded announcement is over, they ask me to stay on the line an extra 2 minutes to take a survey on their service. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I don't need 2 minutes to tell them we got a problem, right? They have a problem. Yeah. So Miguel, let me go back to customer behavior a second.
Yeah.
And this actually applies to everybody in the panel, because it's about numbers. And that is, we saw it after 9/11. We saw it in the 2009 economic debacle. We're seeing it now, where it's changed the pattern of travel. It's not a question of when we're going to travel or where we're going to travel or if we're going to travel. It's how we're going to travel. And what we saw in those three instances were families coming together to travel together, multi-generational travel, a sort of Last Supper approach to travel. If we don't go now, we're never going to go. And we're seeing that again now as we come into the endemic part of COVID. What changes do you see, Miguel, in terms of your numbers, passenger behavior? Diane, we're seeing screening numbers at TSA checkpoints going back to almost 2019 levels. Are you prepared for that now? Because remember, we have a staffing issue worldwide. So how do we deal with getting reconnected and recharged if we can't handle the numbers?
So I think it depends on the market, obviously, right? And now, obviously, the Ukraine-Russia conflict is influencing certain markets. But it's true that we were seeing a huge uplift in terms of bookings, and also changing to what you said on the different generations traveling together. What we are seeing also is that motivations to travel are changing, right? But that's changing very quickly. So depending on the moment, depending on the market, the motivation to travel is changing. And I think for the industry, it's very important to start using more data to listen and understand the different demand signals that will happen in the market in the coming months, right? Because hopefully we won't have any other variants, and hopefully COVID will be over and we will recover again, but we still don't know, right? So I think it's a matter of, it's difficult to have the crystal ball and know how the demand is going to behave in the coming months. It's more about really using data to try to understand the patterns and react to be able to capture that pent-up demand.
Diane?
Certainly, I think in partnership with TSA, looking at the entire travel continuum is really important to us. For that international arrival piece, and knowing that we have to be engaged with both the airlines and the airport authorities. I think you mentioned all of the flights that arrive at once. Automation has just been something that we have been looking to do in every aspect, and building efficiencies into that from a staffing perspective. And we've going back all the way to the merger with CBP, when Immigration and Customs came together, there were clearly efficiencies that we could build into the process. Now, working with TSA, we have the Traveler Verification Service, which is the infrastructure that supports the biometric facial comparison technology. And we're able to provide that as identity as a service to our partners in TSA, but also to our air industry partners and our cruise passenger industry partners, so that they can leverage that technology to build it into the entire travel continuum, and then continue to work with our foreign partners, the airlines that are overseas, to build that into the process. Again, we see the future as that digital travel credential. We're still handling passports today. That's not the future. And whatever that timeline ultimately is going to be, that's why I really appreciate forums like these, even to hear about the challenges in, with respect to the travel agencies and the technology, even the forms of payment is really important to us, because we need to have full visibility on that, because we need to build a process working with TSA and our partners that makes sense, right? And when we talk about traveler behavior, we see that traveler behavior changing. Certainly the pandemic, as mentioned earlier, drove a lot of that change, but also for the industry in making the investments that at the end of the day, that cost savings, it's not about necessarily more people, it's about automation and efficiency. And, we have challenges ourselves with, making sure we have the right number of staff at the right time when there's a flight delay, something as simple as that, or a flight arrives early and there's a domino effect when a number of flights arrive at the same time. But if we can strike the right balance between the technology and, signage is great. It's not the way people receive information to change traveler behavior. It's messaging, it's emails in advance, it's announcements, but also establishing proof of concept and leveraging the parts of the travel continuum so that it's just natural and organic for people to experience that biometric element of it.
Well, let me go back to the conversation here, Diane. Let's say ABC Airline is going to be 2 hours late into Chicago. Are you in contact with them? Do they talk to you? Or, God forbid, they're 20 minutes early. I mean, I would cover that story. But seriously, if they were, do you have enough time and an open line of communication, given the technology that you have right now, to be able to pivot?
As far as the communication, it is a survival tool for us and something that we leverage, not just on an hourly basis, by the minute in some of our ports of entry in the air environment and tracking flights, but certainly the communication is robust. The airports would not be operating the way they were, but it isn't even just about the arrival itself. We also have to think about, again, the entire continuum because of all those connecting passengers on that flight who now have a real shortened time frame if they're going to get on that flight. And how are we going to manage that flow with other flights in the room to make sure we endeavor to get those passengers with the airline on their connecting flights? And at the end of the day, for CBP and TSA, it's about security. We can't compromise security, but what we can do is build those efficiencies into the process. But again, that communication happens electronically, and it happens, in person. It happens, via phone calls. Again, it is constant at the port level, certainly.
I mean, there's always the danger of technology taking, precedence over common sense. I'll give you one example, which we reported on. It was actually quite humorous in the end, where they came up with the idea of a robotic butler at a hotel, so that the butler would deliver room service, a daily newspaper, perhaps an extra towel or a pillow. It didn't really work out very well because every college kid staying at a hotel got out a baseball bat and beat the hell out of the butler. It became a frat party, and in one case, the actual robotic butler on its own escaped from the hotel. It ran away. So sometimes you reach the border of tolerance with technology. But let me go back to the interface that you have, Diane, that you have, Jenny, that you have, Michelle, and that you monitor, Miguel. And that is, let's say, for the sake of our discussion, I make a reservation, let's say online, with a hotel, or maybe I make it through a CWT, and you have my Visa card on file, and you know that I'm paying for it with a Visa card. Now I land at an airport that has a departure tax or an entrance tax or a visa, a visa on arrival. How can you link that in so that that's already waiting for me? How do I get to the hotel now and not have to stop at the front desk because you already have that on file and you already know my preferences? Now, some of that technology was already in place before the pandemic, but how have you evolved it since?
Maybe I'll jump in and picking up actually a little bit on the previous conversation around refunds as well, because I think on consumer behavior, one of the big things about travel in particular is having confidence, and I think that's what we're needing people increasingly to have as they kind of step back into travel. And one of those things, and you said it, you've paid for your hotel with your Visa card, or you've bought your airline with your Visa card. If you have bought your hotel or flight with a Visa card, you do have protection. And I think one of the things that the schemes do particularly well is have all those rules and various liabilities mapped through very, very clearly right the way through to the edge case. So while the volume that we saw of refunds and chargebacks and disputes was, a big step change higher than we would expect, it actually does all come through and work through the system, and it's very clear where that liability rests, and it certainly doesn't rest with the end consumer. So I think it's really important that everyone understands that they are protected if they've paid with Visa, credit or debit. Then the other thing,
was that a promotional statement?
No, I just think it's one of those unknown hidden diamond facts that I think it's an important service that everybody needs to understand. Wow. Because it's a little gem, I think. I also, and we do automate it. So, as a merchant or an issuer or an acquirer now, that is a service that can be automated. And I think that's really important. And it comes back to how do we automate these things? How do we make things more seamless? And I think we can learn from events like COVID, where things have kind of really accelerated, to start to automate and make that more seamless. And certainly that's something we've done with a process called Verify, which is just an example to illustrate that.
Of course, during the pandemic, we learned very quickly that no amount of technology in the world is going to take the place of sovereignty and stupidity, which meant that nobody had a unified, centralized data bank for a COVID passport. Everybody talked about it. It never happened. Everybody was in their own silos. It became more confusing than ever. Crazy stuff, right? And it's never, I hate to use the word never, but it never happened. Let me go back to Diane for a second to say, in the private-public partnership world, do you foresee a situation where one card fits all? It could be your form of payment card. It could be a government ID card that would have your vaccine situation in there. It would have your passport information in there. It would have your emergency information. One-stop shopping that you'd have access to without infringing on people's individual rights.
Privacy is a critical issue for us and baked into all of our programs from the beginning. It's never an afterthought for us, and certainly making sure that we are transparent, and we are required to publish privacy impact assessments for all of the data that we utilize in all of our programs. I just want to kind of, state that because it's so important. We rely on public trust to be able to do what we do on a daily basis. And, in automating the processes that we're doing from a CBP perspective, we built the CBP One app that we launched in October of 2020. And the efforts to do that were to take all of the CBP services that we had mobile applications for or could automate and put them under one portal. There's cargo services under there. There's services for TSA under that application, but services for such as our mobile passport control application, to really house them in one space. And where we see the industry going and communicating and being interactive with passengers, that's what we're endeavoring to do as well, building in information such as baggage carousel information, wait time information, so that we can message. But certainly with looking towards the future with the digital travel credentials for us, a lot of folks with skin in the game and being engaged with IATA and our industry partners, as well as our foreign partners. I recently had traveled to the UAE and to Singapore myself to see what efforts were underway in those countries and have discussions about how we can collaboratively work towards kind of that travel solution. And certainly from a CBP perspective, with all of this automation, and we're not replacing CBP officers or CBP agriculture specialists, what we're able to do is put them on the threats and limit the interactions we have with travelers that really are low risk travelers. Again, at Global Entry, as you mentioned earlier, best case example of, when, we know that a traveler is low risk, there's a level of screening that's already occurred. And I know you had mentioned 17 seconds. I had failed to mention this earlier with the totems. We've seen turnaround times of 5 seconds.
Wow.
And very meaningful throughout the entire process, because that passenger is going to go out, going to potentially recheck, have a connection, and we can't, again, create a choke point somewhere else in the travel continuum because of the success we're having. And it has to be an engagement with everyone involved in the process. And it's not just at the one port location. But is there one solution? I think it's, going to be determined still, as far as how we're going to build that out, but it definitely has to be integrated with all of our partners. And we recognize that.
And of course, the one thing you're not going to replace, please tell me you're not, is the beagle that comes around and sniffs my bag.
There are our pride and joy, our most successful resource when it comes to finding food, that's for sure, and agriculture products.
I got you. Miguel, and to Michelle, first to Michelle, we are all told that, business travel was moribund. It's now starting to come back. But how is it coming back in a different way that lends itself well to all the technological stuff we're talking about right now?
Yeah, I would say that we are absolutely seeing the highest volumes of business travel in the last month that we have seen since the pandemic began. And that's great for the whole industry. What we also see is a real migration. People want online, they're comfortable with technology. Your average business traveler has been working with technology now for 2 years, whether it's Zoom or WebEx or other platforms, messaging platforms. We see people want that omni-channel experience. I start on my phone, Maybe I pick it back up on my computer. If I have trouble, I want to be able to just click a button, talk to an agent. That's been something that we at CWT have seen really be meaningful to travelers as they come back to traveling, is the fact that it's so easy to work throughout the system and throughout the channels. And part of that is because during the pandemic, we actually deployed a truly industry-leading counselor platform behind the scenes so that our counselors can really see travelers wherever they are and know how they're serving them. And we really do see that travelers want that digitization. They want that online, but they also want to be known, and they want their travel experience to be personalized. I mean, Peter, you're obviously a very experienced traveler. You probably have routes that you fly all the time. If you booked with CWT, we would recognize, hey, wait, when you go to Chicago, you always stay at this hotel and you always take the 8 a.m. flight. Then when you go to book that trip again, personalization brings those choices to the top for you and says, these are your favorite choices. You've booked them 10 times in the last year. Are these the ones you would want? People really want to be known in that way, even though it's an online kind of AI driven environment. They still want it to be personal. And we see that in also the reason that people are traveling, right? Reconnecting teams, bringing people together who are working in, remote work teams. We have a big software company that's one of our clients, and one of their top sales leads in the whole company told me, I have a team of 50 salespeople who have never met each other. I've got to bring them together. I've got to find a way for them to truly engage and have that conversation, back to your word, conversation. We are just seeing how meaningful that is. So I think business travel will forever be changed. The world will forever be changed, but I see many positives for travelers, and I see a lot of positives in how they're using travel to really connect with people. And I think that's very meaningful right now.
We talked about the great migration during the pandemic. Technology certainly enabled the world of digital nomads. And now it's how do you bring them back together? So yeah. Miguel, why don't you close it off for us and tell us what really changed in passenger and traveler behavior because of technology, and how is technology going to be used to perhaps change it again?
Well, I first let me just reflect on what Michelle just said, because and on your comment, because I agree. So the industry finally focused on digitalizing the experience of the business traveler. I think that before the pandemic, it was more focused on the leisure traveler. And I think that now, using all the technology, it's great that we are really focusing on improving the experience of a business traveler. Being a very heavy business traveler, I think it's great news. And then the other thing is what you mentioned. So we need to focus on the business travel segment, on the new segments and the new opportunities. So now with the rise of remote working, so now you can work from anywhere. How are we going to facilitate that? And how this is going to be leveraged by the industry to grow and to increase revenue. So I may have someone who is working for my company who was living in Madrid, but now wants to live in the Canary Islands, but they need to come maybe once a month or once a quarter to the office, right? So how are we going to capture that opportunity, and how are we going to give the industry this opportunity to grow? Then to your comment on how everything changed, I just wanted to reflect on something that we have commented during the entire discussion today. So it's true, we commented about a couple of concrete disruption points across the traveler experience. I think there are many, right? And that's something we need to do. And there are two solutions. One is definitely collaboration. So I think we really need everyone to collaborate to make sure that we focus on the traveler. That's critical. And the second one is really to increase technology adoption. So I think our industry is still behind others in adopting technology. We need to do it wisely, as you said, in the example of the robot. That what we say is we believe on the power of technology combined with the human ingenuity to really improve people's life, in this case, travelers' lives, and make sure that we are not doing stupid things with technology, but we are really using technology to make, the life of the traveler easy.
Well, Miguel, I want to go on record as saying we went through the entire session without hearing the word once until you just mentioned it. That's the word disruption. Congratulations. Because we've lived in a disrupted world for the last 2.5 years, but we're about to get disrupted because we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody. Diane, let me know when I can come play with the Beagle. Jenny, thank you so much from Singapore. Miguel from Madrid, and Michelle from Minneapolis. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.